On identity. Like, let's start with, just a little bit of these populations. Is there an Arab identity, like a collective Arab identity?
Well, I think one can say that there are multiple identities.
Yes.
Well, why should we be limited to one? There are several, but what I wanted to point out is something which is, I think, peculiar and distinctive to the Middle East. And that is indicated by the term we use, the Middle East.
Right.
I mean, if we look at the other areas of ancient civilization, India, China, in India and China, they go back to remote antiquity, and they are still India and China.
Right.
And today, they still speak languages and use scripts and profess religions which are recognizably related to those of antiquity.
Right.
And the Middle East is at least as ancient, probably more ancient than either of the others, but the ancient part of it was, so to speak, obliterated.
Right.
The region doesn't have a name. Middle East is obviously a modern name, and it's obviously an alien name. It's designating it by its position as seen from somewhere else.
Right. Is this why people in the Arab world speak so much about authenticity, asala, and the whole
Yes, I think there's part of it.
hyper-authenticity?
Exactly. There is a feeling that there is a lack of authenticity, a lack of genuine identity. I mean, a common Middle Eastern identity is meaningless.
Right.
And as I say, there is no equivalent of India or China in the Middle East. The ancient past was obliterated, and even the memory of the past was wiped out, so to speak, until it was restored to them, mainly by European and American Orientalists and archaeologists.
Right. So do the Arab, is there an Arab, I'm somewhat, as you might suspect, invested in this debate.
Naturally.
Because shortly after your arrival in Princeton, I wrote something that branded me, if you will, for heresy in Arab intellectual circles. I wrote something called The End of Pan-Arabism, an essay in foreign affairs, and which led to the Arab predicament. And the debate still goes on. Is there an Arab identity? And is it a kind of a construct spun by an intellectual class that was imposed on these varied cultures?
Let me tell you a story. Some years ago, I attended the International Congress of Orientalists, which meets regularly at intervals in different places. That particular meeting was in Mexico City. And I was chatting with an Egyptian friend and colleague who had spent a little while there in Mexico and looking around, and he was absolutely stunned by what he saw. And I asked him what it was that so puzzled him about Mexico. And he said, well, in Mexico, as we were, they were discovered, they were conquered. The conquerors imposed both their language and their religion on them. The Mexicans speak Spanish, and they are Catholic Christians. But it wouldn't occur to any Mexican to call himself a Spaniard.
Right.
I thought that was an interesting observation coming from an Egyptian who was visiting Mexico for the first time.
So what remains of this Arab identity? We go back to the time when these doctrines of Arab nationalism were asserted in the aftermath of the demise of the Ottoman Empire. The Arabs were orphaned, if you will.
Right.
They hadn't chosen this identity, but it was a kind of almost like was it an identity by default, that you are orphaned by the collapse of an imperial system, and suddenly this intellectual class, mostly Christian Arabs, assert the Arab identity, and it retains this odd kind of power.
Well, it has been said that all scientific method is comparative.
Yes.
Arabic is not the only language which is spoken by many different peoples.
Yes.
And the same is true of English and Spanish. Now, in this country, people call the language which they speak English, but it wouldn't occur to them to describe themselves as Englishmen.
Right. So why does the Arab world, if you will, hold on to this Arab identity and why does the Arab world assert this identity in the face of an objective reality that says otherwise?
Well, I wouldn't say that the objective reality says otherwise. It is partly true. This common Arab identity is based on a common language. I think what is an important difference is that a continued distinction between written and spoken Arabic.
Right.
Spoken Arabic differs as much as French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian. But written Arabic is in principle the same.
Yes.
It's as if the peoples of Europe had continued into modern times to use Latin as their written language,
Yes.
and regarded Spanish and Italian and French and so on as uncouth dialects.
Right, right. Do you think this Arab idea has served the Arab people well in our time?
I would say that it had a very mixed impact. It did some good. It also did some harm.
Yeah. Now, if you take a look at the contemporary Arab world today, like, how would one look at identity? Let's just take just different Arab spots, just different Arab places one lands, if you will. Like, is there a Saudi identity? I mean, in that regard that is separate from the Arab identity? Of course there is.
I wouldn't say separate from, but distinct within.
Right, distinct
and
within.
There is a common Arab identity, which I think covers all the Arabic-speaking peoples. But within that common Arab identity, there are important subdivisions. I mean, just as English-speaking peoples.
Right.
I mean, an Englishman is not an American is not an Englishman.
Right.
And neither of them is a New Zealander.
Right. How did the Egyptians manage their relation to this Arab identity? I mean,
it's an ongoing struggle.
Yeah.
I went to Egypt for the first time in 1938 when I was a young student. And I've been there many times ever since. And I've got to know a lot of Egyptians. And I find two quite distinct contradictory trends within the Egyptians, which one can meet at different times and talking to different people. One of them is Egypt is Arab, which is the center of the Arab world. It is the natural leader of the Arabs. And the other one is that the Arabs imposed their language on Egypt.
Right.
But Egypt has an ancient and glorious history and identity of its own. And I've heard both of these expressed with great vigor by Egyptian friends when visiting that country.
I think you're absolutely right. I think the Egyptians, are eternally in and out of these different identities. And I think for them, in the whole notion of the debates that you're very familiar with, of an Egyptian national personality. I mean, that's, for...
Egypt is a special case.
Right.
I mean, Egypt is a country well defined by both geography and history.
Right.
There's no doubt about where it is and what it consists of. The other countries of the Arab world, many of them are modern inventions.
Yes, we had a very beloved and irreverent Egyptian friend, the late Egyptian diplomat and scholar Tahsin Bashir.
Yes.
And he was a seminal figure in this kind of Egyptian awakening, and a very unique man. And in one of his irreverent moments, of which he had many, he was a child of Alexandria and a child of a culture that predated the free officers and the time of Nasserism, when he said, well, there is only Egypt, the rest are tribes with flags. It was...
Yes, I remember that phrase.
Yes, and then when called upon to defend it, he said, well, we can, and maybe this is just the kind of a way of thinking of other identities in this region. He said, well, of course, Turkey is a state, and Iran is a state, but he was referring to the Arab world. I mean, this was the kind of the reference. It's hard to be definitive about this question of an Arab identity. I mean, I myself have struggled with this and wrestled with this both personally and intellectually. I walk into Tunisia after a flight, or I just recently was in Saudi Arabia, and there's no doubt you walk into an Arab culture. There's no doubt that there is a kind of a common repository of ideas. There is obviously an Arab who doesn't treasure the great legacy of Kulthum is not an Arab at all. So there is this common identity, this repository Arab culture, and it has a vitality of its own.
Just as the English culture, which has a native speaker of English who was brought up on Shakespeare, something which I share with people from very remote and very different countries who also speak English.
Right. Now, Iraq had occupied some of your interest and attention, and how does the Arab idea play out in Iraq?
Well, Iraq is one of the countries where the Arabs are not alone.
Yes.
There are two main non-Arab groups in the Arab world, the Kurds who are in Iraq and in Syria and in some of the neighboring countries, Turkey, of course, Iran, and then there are the Berbers in North Africa.
Yes.
And it's a striking phenomenon that the Kurds and the Berbers, two very ancient peoples, neither of them has achieved statehood.
Yes.
They remain, how shall I put it, subordinate groups.
Yeah.
Now in Arab countries.
Well, there's something very interesting about Iraq, and it's not my thought. It's a thought of a friend, of a mutual friend of mine, and I mean of ours, and that's Ahmed Shalabi.
Yes.
And Ahmed Shalabi he said, look, there is something very interesting about Iraq, even though Iraq, in the language of the Ba'athists and the language of Saddam Hussein, was the eastern gate of the Arab world, that if you take a look at Iraq, that the two centers, the two borders, if you will, which are contiguous human borders where there is populations across the line for Iraq, are Turkey and Iran. That the borders of Iraq with the Arab states are deserts. Yeah. They're not really inhabited by anyone. So ironically, this Iraqi nation state, which emerged in the aftermath of the Great War, in many ways invented, manufactured by Pax Britannica, which has been very, very, if you will, in the past, quite militant about Arabism, does have these very non-Arab borders. And it has this non-Arab community that you're talking about, 20% or so, who are Kurds in the north.
Yes. The name Iraq, as the name of a state, is entirely modern.
Yes.
There was no country called Iraq. There was a region which called Iraq, which included only the southern half of the present state of Iraq and the adjoining area of Iran. Right. There was Iraq Arabi and Iraq Ajami.
Right. Now, it's interesting. I don't know, I mean, as you know, in the last 5 or 6 years, I've spent a lot of time in Iraq, in and out of Iraq. I've also spent quite a bit of time in and out of Kurdistan in particular. Mm-hmm. I have a tremendous affection for the Kurds, a tremendous respect for what they've gone through and how they've tried to come out of the nightmare that was inflicted on them in the last 30 or 40 years. And it's very interesting to me when you go, which has to do with identity. If you walk into Kurdistan and you step up to have a conversation with a Kurd over age 40, it's almost like you can tell the divide. Mm-hmm. You can speak to them in Arabic. Yeah. Under 30, 30 and under, 35 and under, they do not speak Arabic, because the separation of this creating of this autonomous, if you will, government of Kurdistan, that the young people of Kurdistan really don't identify. They now identify themselves much more than their elders with the whole with the Kurdish identity. That's what it is for them. It's about Kurdistan.
May I tell you a true story from World War II? In Iraq, there was an officer in the British Army who was a specialist on Arab matters. It was a Highland regiment, yes. And he spoke Arabic fluently. One day he left to go on what we call detached duty, and he did what he had to do. And on his way back to rejoin his regiment, he was captured by a group whom we called bandits, right, and who called themselves patriots.
Of course.
And they treated him very courteously. They tied him hand and foot, and they said, we're going to kill you, of course, but not immediately, because our leader is away, and we want to keep him. We want to keep you alive until he gets back, so that he can meet you and talk to you. And this officer said, well, I'm your prisoner, you will do with me as you choose, but do you mind telling me why you want to kill me? And they said, well, it's obvious, because you're English. And he said, well, kill me if you must, but not for the wrong reason. I am not English. And they said to him, what do you mean you're not English? You're an English officer, you're wearing an English uniform. He said, no. He said, I'm not English. And they said, well, what are you? He said, I'm a Scot. And they said, what's that? Hadn't a clue. So he tried to explain to them that in Britain there were two people, Scots in the north, English in the south. He said, we have a common government which is called British. We serve in the same army which is called British. We have the same uniform which is British. Just as here in Iraq, you have an Iraqi government and an Iraqi army. You have Kurds in the north and Arabs in the south. You're all Iraqis. But a Kurd is not an Arab and an Arab is not a Kurd. But it's like that with us. an Englishman is not a Scot and a Scot is not an Englishman, and I am a Scot. There was a moment of silence, and then one of them came up to him with a knife, said, "Don't be alarmed, I'm cutting your bonds. We wouldn't dream of harming a fellow Kurd."
That's a great one.
And he said, "But would you be willing to stay as our guest overnight, so that our leader may have the privilege of meeting you and talking to you?" This is not a joke. I mean, this really happened.
Right. So where do you see the Kurds? What is since you said the Kurds have this distinction of being this, 20, 25 million, I don't know what the numbers are.
Yeah.
And there is it's in the case of the Kurds, as opposed to, and the comparison has been made, as opposed to the Palestinians, it's not like one return address. The return address for the Kurds is Damascus, it's Baghdad, it's Tehran, and it's Ankara. I mean, the Kurds, what are the prospects?
I think
the Kurds?
the Kurdish problem will continue. Two possibilities. Either they will have some sort of Kurdish autonomy or independence, or they will continue to be a trouble spot.
Right.
I don't see any third possibility.
Right. I'm somewhat optimistic for the Kurds within Iraq. I think the Kurds have drawn the essential conclusion. There can be no statehood, if we mean by statehood a flag independently. Though when you do go to Kurdistan, by the way, there are more Kurdish flags than there are Iraqi flags. Yes, definitely. And I serve on the board of trustees of a university which was created by, again, another one of we seem to have the same friends. We also have the same enemies. But our friend Barham Saleh, the deputy prime minister of Iraq, who now may be heading back to Kurdistan. He may be leaving Baghdad to go to Kurdistan as a prime minister of the regional government of Kurdistan. I think the Kurds have drawn a very smart conclusion. They can have a state in all but name in Iraq. I think they've given up on what can be obtained elsewhere. They can't obtain much in Iran. They can't obtain much beyond their civic rights in Turkey.
I would say they're doing rather better in Turkey.
Are they?
Oh yes, there has been a change.
Right.
I mean, the Kurdish language is now permitted.
Yes.
You can buy Kurdish books in bookstores in Istanbul and Ankara. They're allowed to speak Kurdish in public. There has been a considerable relaxation of the earlier insistence on purely Turkish identity.
So Turkish identity is no longer as sharply, if you will, and exclusively
no
defined as before.
Right.
And how does one account for this change, I mean, for the Kurds in Turkey?
I think it's partly due to the fact that the present Turkish leadership put more emphasis on their Islamic identity than on their Turkish identity.
Right. Which leads us, again, traveling this journey across identities to Turkey. I mean, so this concept of Turkish identity, which is post-imperial, post-Ottoman,
and increasingly post-Kemalist.
Post-Kemalist. I remember 3 years ago, I believe, in Philadelphia at the World Affairs Council for the Big Bash for your 90th birthday, someone asked you about the situation in Turkey, and of course it was a vintage Bernard Lewis answer. You said, well, the situation in Turkey is murky. Now, is it still murky? I mean, in this debate, if you will, and the struggle between Kemalism and Islamism,
yes,
is that simplifying it too much?
No, I don't think you're simplifying it too much. I think the struggle is still going on, and the outlook is very problematic. At the moment, it seems that the trend towards re-Islamization is the stronger one.
Right.
This has happened before in the Turkish Republic, but it's never gone as far or as profoundly as at the present time. They're handling it with great skill, and what they have been doing is to gradually obtain control of various branches of the society, of the business world, of the media, of the police, and so on and so on.
So the Islamists are winning in Turkey?
It looks like it.
And it would appear that the Kemalists are in retreat.
I think that is the situation.
And it appears that it came in through, if you will, quote-unquote, democratic means. I mean, I think I have a small idea to present to you, that in the case of Pakistan and Turkey, maybe secularism is, at least for me, is much more precious than democracy. I mean that that there is a tension, if you will, between secularism and democracy. And in the case of Turkey, the Kemalist project put in place, as you told us in your memorable and classic work, The Emergence of Modern Turkey. We have seen the emergence of the secular enterprise in Turkey in the 20s, and now here we are, some 80 whatever years later, that Turkey is having second thoughts about its identity.
Oh, things are moving that way, certainly.
Yes.
You can see it in many, many different ways. The most important of which is how shall I put it, the way the army is responding.
Yes.
Or rather not responding.
Right. Well, there is an irony in Turkey, which is that the Islamists now wish to take Turkey into Europe. And the Kemalists, who had argued, if you will, that Turkey was a Western society or should be a Western society, are very, very dubious about the journey to Europe, because obviously the Islamists would like to rein in the military. And they would like to rein in the Kemalists.
Yes.
And they would depend on the forms of European society, that there would be no coup d'etat, there would be no intervention in...
Well, one of the main obstacles to Turkey's acceptance in Europe in the past has been these, you can call them military coup. The Turks don't like to call them that.
Interventions.
Interventions. Is
Rescue operations.
Müdahale.
Yes.
The word they use is intervention, which has a nice, clean, surgical connotation. Yes. They come in, they do what they have to do, and then they leave.
Yes.
Because one thing which is remarkable about these 4 Turkish interventions so far is that each time they come, they seize power, they remove the government, and they say, we're going to restore democracy, and then we're going to return to the barracks. And each time nobody believed them.
Nobody believed them.
And each time they did just that.
Right.
And the reason they did that is I think they were intelligent enough to see that the army in politics means politics in the army.
Right.
And that if the army retained in a major political role, it would destroy the army.
Right. Now, Turkey isn't a place I'm very intimately familiar with. My sense of Turkish foreign policy and Turkish identity and the way Turkey defines its place in the world is that in the past the Turks were comfortable with this triangle, Turkey, Israel, and the United States.
Yes.
That's the triangle within which they operated. Now the Islamists, Erdogan, Gül, etc., they're a different political class.
Very different.
And they have, if you will, redefined the Turkish project and the Turkish place in the world.
Yes. And they will go further. I can even imagine a future in which Turkey and Iran change places, in which the opposition finally triumphs in Iran, and Iran becomes a secular democracy,
right?
And Turkey becomes an Islamic republic.
That's quite an interesting projection.
It's an exchange of roles of these two countries. I'm not saying that will happen, but I see this as a possibility, because in both countries, things are moving in that direction.
Right. On the subject of Turkish identity, the other great figure of the 90s, in the 90s there were, I believe, 2 men who told us that the illusions of the 90s about the borderless world and the end of ideology and the end of history were wrong, that all this was nonsense intellectually. One was, of course, yourself. The other one was the late and brilliant political scientist Sam Huntington, who argued in The Clash of Civilizations that it ain't so, that this borderless world was just at best wishful thinking. And Huntington had a very interesting concept. He applied it to Mexico, Russia, and Turkey. He said that they were torn countries, that the elites belong to one world and the mass belongs to another world. And in torn countries, one of 2 outcomes happens. Either the elite changes the culture or the culture seizes hold of the state. I think it's working out in Turkey that way.
In Turkey, for a long time, it was going one way.
Yes.
And now it's being reversed.
Yes, and I think the position of Europe toward that is of tremendous importance.
Well, but Europe is also changing.
Exactly.
In that respect.
Exactly. You said something quite, very intriguing about Iran, and that it's conceivable, if you will, that the Iranian opposition, I don't know what we call it, the bourgeois opposition, the liberals, the modernists, the people who want a normal life. Yes. I think that's the way I define them. I don't like this distinction between modernists and fundamentalists. The people who just want a normal modern life, that should they win, they could reverse this autocratic, theocratic culture that the clergy, that the Khomeinis imposed on Iran in 1979, that this is not irreversible. I mean, in the scheme of things, 30 years.
I have the impression now that for the first time, the theocratic regime is seriously endangered.
Yes.
And from the way they are speaking and acting, obviously they feel that too.
Yes. I mean, my sense is that whatever happens in Iran next, and the one thing I always defer to in my Arabic ancestral culture is to always say, Allahu Alam, only God knows how it will work out, is that 1979 to 2009, this is the bookends of a time in Iran. That's it, 30 years. You have Khomeini coming back from exile as one of his great rival. Shariat Madari said, we expected the return of the hidden Imam, but not by jumbo jet from Paris. But he came back by jumbo jet from Paris, and he imposed this new identity, if you will. Can we say a new identity? Or is that too big a notion? I mean, a new definition of politics?
A new definition, I think.
A new definition of politics? And it was, what, more Islamic and less Persian, or is that wrong?
Oh, definitely right, I would say.
Yes.
I mean, Iran doesn't seem to mean much to him.
Yes. I mean, can we see him, if you will, like as a kind of a turban Shah, that maybe there was more of a maybe there was more of a Persian content in this revolution.
I mean, if you look at his book,
yes,
Islamic Government, he spells it out very clearly and I would say very honestly.
Right. Well, the only people who were deluded were the ones who chose to be deluded. Because in fact, as people who read Khomeini, he made no secret of what he wanted.
Well, when the Iranian Revolution began, I was in Princeton. I had returned not long previously from a visit to Iran.
Right.
And I began to hear news items about this man, Khomeini.
Yes.
I must confess that the name was entirely unknown to me at that point. So I did what we normally do in our profession. I went to the university library, looked up the name Khomeini to see if there was anything either by him or about him.
Yes.
And I found a book of his called Islamic Government, which was a series of lectures which he had given in Iraq at a Shiite seminary, and which was then published. I checked this book out and read it, and that made it quite clear who he was and where he was going.
Right.
And the nonsense that we were reading in the press at the time, that this was going to be the liberal revolution,
of course.
The tyrannical rule of the Shah would be replaced by a liberal democracy and so on, would be all nonsense. I tried to explain this to people at the time, but nobody wanted to listen.
Well, I remember these events well. I was quite young, and I was listening to two Princeton luminaries at the time. One was you, and saying this, and one was a colleague of mine in the department that I taught at Princeton, in the Department of Politics, a man by the name of Richard Falk, who had gone to Paris and had been granted a 6-minute or I don't know how many minutes audience with Khomeini, and Khomeini had given him the argument, the very, very liberal argument, like, look, this will be this, just the kind of the usual blather that would be offered to a foreign visitor. But indeed, Khomeini made no secret of what he wanted, the imposition of a reign of virtue and terror and an Islamic state. And when people said, what about a democratic, can we have the word democratic in the name of Iran? He said, no, it's the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this is...
I tried to point out at the time that Khomeini's position was very clearly stated in this book of his, and chaps in Washington just refused to admit the existence of the book. I said that there were copies of it in the Princeton University Library. And they said, well, it may have been planted by some hostile agency. And I said, well, I must have been very far-sighted because the book has been there 10 years. The accession dates on books in the catalogue.
Probably not checked out.
The problem was that the book was only available in Arabic and in Persian, not in any Western language. And therefore, as far as the people who mattered, it just didn't exist.
Now, the Iranians have inserted themselves into the politics of the Arab world very successfully in the last couple of decades or so. Now that too is a kind of an interesting change in identity on the part of the Iranians. And they have made it all the way. I always say now that what the Iranians wanted, they wanted to share a border with Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And they now share a border with Israel.
In effect, yes.
In effect. They secured a border through Hezbollah. Mm-hmm. That's my description of the Iranian push into the Arab world, is that they have made it all the way to...
Well, they have two borders with Israel.
Yes. How the...
Hezbollah and Gaza.
Right. But Hezbollah is a genuine border in many ways that the Iranians have secured. Right. And I think that many, when the Arabs now complain about Iran penetrating Arab society, I actually do not feel terribly sorry for many of the Arabs, because in many ways they're hoisted on their own petard. Mm-hmm. Like if you take a look at the way the Arabs, that's another long topic, how the Arabs treated the Shia of Lebanon, it wasn't very well. No. And the Iranians therefore found them easy picking, because you could come into Lebanon and find a population that hasn't really been catered to or even claimed by the Arab states and the larger Arab world. And the Iranians found it a very easy world. Mm-hmm. And they have practically a small Iranian army in Hezbollah. It has all the things that these organizations have, a satellite television channel.
Yeah. But what do you think of the effect that this is having on the Arab governments of the region? I mean, for example, in 2006, when the Israelis fought a war against Hezbollah,
absolutely,
it was quite obvious that the Arab states were hoping that they would finish the job.
Yes.
There was none of the usual cries of outrage and support.
Yes, and
they were obviously very disappointed when the Israelis messed up.
Yes, and what's interesting is the change, if you will, the so-called Arab Street, a subject on which I have spent enormous amount of ink and passion. The so-called Arab Street identified with Hassan Nasrallah and with his war in 2006. And it was said, well, look, now the Sunni-Shia divide has been bridged, the Sunni-Shia identity, if you will, those kinds of warring identities have been brought together. Well, 2 years later, Nasrallah struck into West Beirut, and he took on the Sunni bourgeoisie of West Beirut, and he took on Saad Hariri and his people. And guess what? The feeling toward him in the Arab world changed immediately. He became a brigand and a bandit because he was attacking West Beirut. And this was while you can hail him in 2006, he was suddenly condemned in 2008, and it showed you that these old visceral enmities and identities endure in many ways. I think that it would be fair, am I right, that most of what we know about the Arab world, I plead guilty as a boy of Beirut, born in 1945 and came into my own during the Nasserist era and into the Six-Day War and beyond. Most of what we know about the Arab world, most of what we say is from the Mashriq, from the Arab East.
Yes,
the Maghrib is, it's almost like an afterthought. I think very few Arabs know much about the Maghrib, very few Arabs from the East.
I think that's true, yes. I've been to Tunisia a few times. I've been to Algeria once on a rather long visit,
right,
which was a very interesting one.
Yes.
And
when was sort of like in the after independence?
Oh yes, my visit to Algeria was just before I came to America, so it would have been in the early 70s.
Okay. So so what are these identities in the Maghrib? I mean, my sense is that the Maghrib is so dipped in French and France that in many ways, perhaps there is another identity there, an elite identity, which is what French rule and a French presence left.
One thing which struck me, which astonished me in Algeria, was the anti-Egyptian feeling there.
Yes.
I wondered why on earth should they feel anti-Egyptian. And the reason came out in conversations that after they became independent, after a long and hard-fought war in which they were victorious against France,
right,
Egyptians sent officers to tell them how to run things and how to do things. He said the Egyptians, who could be beaten in a few days by Israel, came to teach the Algerians, who had defeated France in a long, hard war.
Yes, and 1 million martyrs as the language.
And tell them how to do things. They were absolutely furious. I mean, this came out again and again and again in conversations. This feeling of anger.
Yeah.
And one thing which struck me in Algiers, for example, was that it was very difficult to find Arabic books.
Yes.
All the bookshops, they had only French books.
Yes.
And one of the bookshops, I said, well, don't you have any Arabic books? Oh, he said, if you want Arabic books, go to the Kasbah, you'll find them there.
Right.
So I went to the Kasbah, and they had Arabic books, school books, that's all, school textbooks.
Yes.
So one day at a dinner party, I found myself sitting next to the director of the National Library. So I thought this was a good opportunity to find out why. I mean, after all, they are an Arab country, they speak Arabic, and yet this total lack of interest in Arab books. And he said, well, he said, you know, on French rule, we couldn't do very much by way of producing books in Arabic. He said, after independence, a lot of stuff came in from Egypt. And he said it just didn't work. He said, under the French, we had become accustomed to a certain cultural level.
Right. And they had become accustomed to a certain level.
And they didn't like what came from the East.
Now, is there, like, I mean, there is one place in the Arab world where I can take my Arabic, my Lebanese dialect, but really sort of a standard Arabic, and it doesn't carry me very far, which is Morocco.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I am aware in Morocco.
Yes.
I mean, it's very interesting. I've gone into Tunis, and I felt I could find an Arabic culture there. I walk into Morocco, and I am at a loss to relate to Moroccans through this Arab cultural matrix.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, I have no native Arabic, but the Arabic that I learned principally was Egyptian.
Yes.
And then a little bit of Syrian. And I found I could manage in Tunisia.
Yes.
It was difficult in Algeria and impossible in Morocco.
Impossible in Morocco. So where are the, is there a kind of an...
But the written language is the same.
The written language is the same.
More or less.
Yes, but I think that, you know, my impressions, from just a little bit of traveling and a lecture here or there, is that really the imprint of the Arab world in the Maghreb, in North Africa, is slight. It's faint. And I think there is no denying the deep prestige and influence of French culture on them. Absolutely.
That's true.
Now, what about the Berbers, since you already, at the beginning, in talking about the...
Well, one thing which struck me in Algiers, a number of receptions and parties that I went to during my stay there, and there were a lot of people, sooner or later, would take me aside and say, you know, I am of Berber ancestry.
Right.
It was something which was at once to be quiet about and to be proud of.
Right.